Welcome all you 6 or 7 people who join us and watch these things. So, what is this, episode 6 or 7? I think it's 6.
This is episode 6.
Uh,
Yes.
All right, cool. And then you had a topic you wanted to discuss, kind of diving deeper into like cultural roles and then also the risk of rejecting cultural meanings or
Right.
the ambiguity around how we can actually know reality, kind of a mix of all those
Right.
things.
And particularly, you raised the question of how do we establish a morality when we don't know absolutely what's going on? And I wanted to begin with getting a better understanding uh, from your perspective. What what does all that look like to you? You're the one that posed the question or the comment. So I want to get more familiar, get more in depth uh, with what all that looks like for you. Let's start with the question about establishing morality when we know we don't know.
Well, let's just maybe talk about how, like, morality a little bit. Maybe there's like 3 general categories, I think. The first is
Right,
just like natural law, right? Survival of the fittest, life eats life to survive. There is no sort of value or morality except for, the behavior that gets you to the next day and allows you to procreate and feed and all that kind of stuff, right? So in that sense, you could say there's a natural morality, which is sort of amoral, and then like you have on the other side of the spectrum, maybe you have a religious morality, right? A morality
yeah.
that
What? Oh, the religious reality,
morality,
morality.
yeah. So
Yeah,
something inscribed in stone, by God through Moses or whatever your religion is. You have a belief system, a religious belief system. And in that belief system, there's a set of rules for your behavior and conduct and stuff, and you take that as law, and that becomes your morality, and it comes from an external source. And then I guess the third one would be sort of a secular ethics, right? And that's like the ability to sort of use philosophy and logic to create your own system of ethics. So I guess we got natural law, we got secular ethics, and we got religious morality. I guess would be the 3 categories. And so I think that we're talking about secular ethics, right? Like how do you go about generating your own set of secular ethics?
yeah, yeah. That breaks it down. And what comes to my mind is the what you're calling the natural morality, which I think of that in terms of do what works. There's one edict about that type of that approach to morality or ethics, and it's do what works. And then that raises, of course, the question of, well, what does that mean? What's the definition of what works? And in terms of the natural laws, it's survival. You do what you need to do to survive, and that's pretty much the totality of it. And we see that in nature. At Squirrel University here, I watch the critters, and they seem to do like 3 things that they do. They do what they have to do to stay alive, and to some degree make life as comfortable for them as they know how to make it for them. Like they'll go lay in the shade if it's too hot, right? But then they stop. To me, that's a really significant thing. Is that once they have their own well-being handled, they stop doing. They don't have a whole bunch of other things that they feel obligated to go do. So they spend a lot of leisure time. The natural way has way more leisure time in it than the way that man has constructed for itself.
I think that's because they're capable of homeostasis, whereas human beings, we're in a constant state of hypervigilance due to our existential anxiety.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I think,
yeah.
yeah, that definitely is probably at play there. The unbearable lightness of being is the terror of being aware of that you're alive, and and you're under constant threat of not being alive. The death anxiety thing, I guess, is what that refers to. But anyway, so the natural way, the natural what could be seen as a natural morality is in some ways is pretty kind of crude and brute, as in, do what you have to do to stay alive. And
Or thrive.
uh,
Like
well, and
think
then
of
yeah,
1980s Wall Street. It's dog
yeah,
eat dog. It's amoral. Yeah.
yeah. But I don't see that as an example of thriving. And I think for even animals that they don't have to deal with the abstract reality that their brain doesn't create for them. Whereas our brain creates an abstract reality that now we have to, we don't know that that's not, we're not aware of most of the time the abstract reality. We don't treat it as anything different than the natural reality. And so that feeds into why we can't just be content. And so the point that I'm connecting with in that natural morality that you mentioned is, in my observation of nature, it has a self-regulator in it. It's like when the squirrels get enough, they stop, you know. And now I'm interrupted with the thought of, well, what about the woodpeckers? They never stop stuffing acorns in holes or making holes to stuff acorns into. So I don't know. Maybe they've borrowed something from the Homo sapiens there, as far as having an insatiable appetite. But overall, generally, I mean, we look at nature and we can see that they do what they need to survive. And I said there were three things: they reprocreate, uh, they create young, and they raise young, right? And then the third thing they do is what they do after they've done enough of that, which is just relax, just you know leisure time, just sit, lay on a rock or a limb on a tree or something, and so that looks like a pretty wholesome kind of morality, and it's what I call do what works, and what works according to well-being. So
Well, you're talking
that's
about
kind of,
squirrels, though. But I mean, if you change your, maybe talk about tigers. That's a little
well,
different because
or
tigers,
what about the hawks?
right? Hawks. Yeah.
Yeah, the predators. But again, a hawk will swoop down, grab a squirrel, and have a meal, you know, and then it goes sit on a branch someplace. It doesn't go after another meal until it's hungry.
Right.
It's accountable to its biology. Its biological needs is what the hawk responds to. The same way the squirrel, has a sensitivity to the shadow coming across the ground, and so they hightail it for cover. That's just their instinct, or particular sounds or whatever. They're very skittish, but that's part of how they survive. So when they feel uncomfortable about where they are, boy, they get someplace else. They get in their burrow. uh, but then that's it. They don't take anything with them,
Right.
apparently. you know
Then you have
so
pack
yeah.
animals. So you could
Say
say
again.
like pack animals, like
Yeah,
wolves and gorillas and chimps and stuff like that.
right,
That
yeah.
lives in groups to where their individual narcissism has to be checked to a point, right? Because there's broader considerations for the well-being of the entire group or
That's
survival of the
right.
group, right? And so
and,
you
and
have like the beginning of what you would call, I guess Freud would call the superego, with in groups of pack animals, right?
uh-huh.
Since we come from pack animals or from group animals, I think a lot of our sense of morality, even the symbolic senses, I think borrow from these genetically programmed, behaviors involved with or relating to interacting with a group.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's yeah.
Well, and we still carry that genetics or biology that regulates the natural The natural morality, the regulation of the natural morality is still within ourselves. I'm convinced that most human beings have a faculty called conscience. And it's a very primal, primitive kind of thing, but also until it gets polluted with all sorts of abstract values, shoulds, the conscience of a child looks pretty close to that natural regulation of a biological morality of do what works. I
Yeah.
mean, that doesn't mean that children don't do things that are hurtful for others, but they're pretty quick to pick up on remorse for having caused harm.
So I think going back to your original question, right, was about
Yeah,
how, because of the ambiguity of reality, right, and how we're dependent on our
right.
senses, and our senses can be manipulated by ourselves, and just how they evolve. They're not very
Exactly.
accurate most of the time, and so how do we get a sense of reality, right?
Uh-huh.
And I think that there's no like direct connection to reality, and we have to do the best we can within this hallucination that we're living in based on sensory data
Yeah,
input, right?
yeah.
But I think there's a lot that we can do, because I guess the very first thing would be to try to eliminate bias, because I mean bias is kind of the number one delusion creator. I think that's going to be the biggest thing that gets in the way from you perceiving as accurately as possible, right?
Well, the bias, I agree that the bias is a very important factor. And I think it's more about the bias is what sustains the erroneous conclusions. But the erroneous conclusions, I think, have to have something other than bias. There has to be some input.
Well, I'm just saying that's one of the things that's one of the things that you can strive to eliminate in order to perceive the world more accurately.
Right.
Just yeah. So yeah, the bias is there for a reason, right? We have a bias because primarily we want to see ourselves as objects of primary value in a world of meaning, right?
Say
It's
that again.
so we want to see ourselves as objects of primary value in a world of meaning,
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so we have to create like a cultural framework. It's kind of like the context, a contextual filter through which
exactly.
we perceive reality. That somehow like I'm not articulating myself well today. So the contextual filter that we create, that our data sensory input goes through before sort of it hits the limbic system,
Right.
right? Yeah, it's gonna. What am I trying to say here? It minimizes anxiety. It gives a sense of meaning and purpose. It gives a sense that I am the center of the universe. I am valuable. I have self esteem. Compared to other people, I am better than them and more worthy of symbolic immortality or something like that, right? So we
Yeah,
have
well,
to.
I would agree with that if we put it kind of on a continuum with grades. In other words, I don't think that all the attributes that you just described there, I think, are part of what's going on, but they're not necessarily present in every situation. Like it's a it's degrees of esteem, and I think it's social esteem. It seems to me that social esteem is connected to our instinct for survival, and but it's at a symbolic or abstract level, but that the ideas and concepts I have about my value to my community is charged with the same energy that my survival instinct is charged with. So it's like linking the concept of social esteem or social value is connected or linked to that energy, that primal energy of survival. So then what happens is if my symbolic value looks threatened, it registers the same as though I'm being threatened.
Right,
Am I
but
making any
I'm
sense
just
there?
giving an example of how that your own personal needs, existential needs, and biases create sort of this contextual filter that warps reality, right? And so,
Yeah.
like these are some barriers to perceiving as accurately as possible. So this is just one example I'm giving, right? Because
Right.
we have all these layers of these contextual filters that contextualize sensory data input, and they create a narrative for us, you know, and that narrative's goal is to get us through this. I don't know, the anomaly of consciousness, this very weird stage of evolution we are in when we're both like conscious and instinctual, right? Our knowledge of
Yeah.
death triggers our fight or flight mechanism, right? And so there's like, we're in a really shitty situation right now. And so one of the ways that we deal with it is by creating these contextual filters that create narratives. And
Well, and
so
I think
we have to deconstruct these contextual filters, right? If we want to perceive the world accurately, right? And so we have to overcome a lot of our existential fears and crises and stuff like that. Even try to overcome some of our biological, instinctual filters, right? If we want to perceive the world accurately. So that's what I'm saying. We have all these biases intrinsic, you know, to being human. And so we have to sort of analyze what those are and start deconstructing those in order for us to gain a sense of like, or be able to perceive more accurately. But then those, you also mentioned there's risks involved in that, right? So there's a
yeah.
lot of risk in deconstructing like contextual filters that create narratives that are anxiety reducing or buffering, because you know, like, what if you convince yourself that all culture is bullshit, all value is meaningless, all this kind of thing?
Right.
You know, so are you going to be able to sustain yourself on an emotional level with that sort of worldview? You know, so it's like there is risks. I mean, are you risking insanity by going too deep? That's what, like Nietzsche says, when you stare into the void stares back into you, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, so what is it? Is that journey, you know, that effort to deconstruct your own defense mechanisms worth it? You know, or is it better to be nicely tucked into a world of delusion and not have overwhelming anxiety or terror?
Yeah. Now we've kind of segued into the other topic, which is the risk, the risk of not taking up a prescribed social role and attempting to create your own role, to walk your own path, and it's related or connected to what we were just talking about here about the context that we create, because the social role, I think, you know, the store bought one, we, you know, from society, we it comes with a ready made filter.
Yeah.
It comes with a belief system of what is real and what isn't real, a value system that of what is important and what's not important. It also comes with information, you know, kind of like knowledge or data, that isn't from our own knowledge or our own experience, but it's from somebody else's experience, closely related to a belief system, but there's knowledge. And there are two other elements that come into play in that context or that filter that you're talking about. Let me see if I can recall here. So we have knowledge and beliefs, and we have values. Oh, and then there's attitude, which is a very sort of fuzzy, ethereal, sort of not very concrete thing, attitude. However, it's a very powerful kind of thing. And then there's intention.
These are all
Because,
encapsulated in a narrative too.
say again?
I said these are all encapsulated in a narrative.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. So these are when you talk about personal context or that filter, those are five elements that I've identified for myself that are very active. And with if we take on a role like, you know, I'm from society, let's say, well, religion does a pretty good job of giving ready-made roles to play or contexts to live your life by, right? And the context is what brings meaning and significance to our life, which I think is an existential itch that most human beings are busy trying to scratch, maybe not scratching it, but certainly trying to scratch it to satisfy that urge for meaning and significance. And and religion definitely does that. But there are all sorts of other group things like social clubs, country clubs, maybe professions. So these are all different types of roles that we can just pick it up and paint by numbers.
Yeah, it's a template. Yeah.
Yeah, as a template. And you're right that there's benefits to doing that. And but there's also hazards to not doing that. And that's the part that has been the big learning thing for me over the years is realizing what those hazards are, what those variables are. And I'm in a stage where I'm taking inventory on, okay, how did I do? Right? I know what I set out to do with my life, and I know where I've gotten to, and there's a significant difference between those two. And it's like, okay, how did I end up here instead of there? And it has to do with how well did I create my own role? Because I certainly started out on the all culture is bullshit sort of angle of things, and not entirely, but to a major degree. And my naivete as a youth took me to a very high level of confidence in I'll figure it out my own way. I don't need society to give me a role. I don't need to conform to something external in order for me to do what I want to do with my life. And so I've learned a lot about what those variables are, or what you refer to as the hazards, because society has the benefit of a few million years of evolution behind their so-called bullshit cultures. As fallible as those cultures are, as imperfect, we would say, as they are, they're still very well informed. Those cultures have evolved also,
Yeah, but
I'm thinking I'm going to start off with whatever I have internally.
You might reject a certain aspect of the culture, but I mean, you're still wearing clothes, right? You're not like you're not taking shits in front of in front of people in the middle of the street, right? So you do it in the bathroom. Like the way you handle your own animality and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, you're totally up to your eyeballs in culture, right? So you might reject certain aspects of culture, but yeah, we're all like neck deep in it, right?
Yeah, the thing is if I'm gonna, that idealism that I had as a younger person, that I'll figure it out on my own, right? And that I don't need the establishment and whatnot. It was very naive because the only way I could do that is go off into the bush someplace, with a big stick and figure it out. Because if I'm not out there totally in nature, completely on my own, trying to survive, then I'm necessarily involved with culture. Right. And if I go back to the natural morality of do what works, there's certain things that if you don't comply to the establishment or the consensus reality, it's not going to work for you. And we have lots of people who are trying to prove that they have a right to do their own thing, irregardless of the social norms, and then getting treated the way society will treat you if you don't follow the social norms.
Yeah, if you challenge cultural value systems, you become a threat to people who rely on them for their sense of meaning and purpose, right?
Yeah.
And so you're just setting yourself up to become a scapegoat.
So we're not.
Yeah.
We can't be a purist and live with the conveniences of culture and society. And so that's part of what I've learned is, that I remember there was a point at which I realized that I am a social creature, and what that meant to me is that I'm not immune to the impact of the society that I live in. That I've taken on the social values around me. For example, consumerism. I'm much more of a consumerist than what I like being, but I also recognize that it's almost like being having an addiction, in that I go against what my values are for the benefit of being in society,
Yeah,
because
right.
I'm not immune.
But the consumer thing's interesting because remember we talked about there's a life cycle to culture, a cultural life cycle. There's a renaissance,
Yeah.
the period of normalization, decay, and then destruction, and then another renaissance, and that seems to be the cycle. But like
Uh huh.
you could say each culture, each consumer purchase, so has that same thing, right? So like there's a renaissance, like this excitement about getting something new. You invest a lot of energy into researching this certain
Yeah.
product and some excitement about it, right?
Uh huh.
Then there's the purchase, and then there's the period of normalization, then the sense of excitement and all that kind of stuff. It goes through a period of decay, and then it's destruction. It provides no meaning at all, and then the cycle begins again with a new purchase, right?
Well,
Right.
there's one more step in the cycle, though.
Uh,
You rent space at Daryl's mini storage.
yeah. But it's funny that but that's what consumerism is very interesting because it consumer capitalism in the United States is a very good experiment because of how multicultural we are, right? And so most people when
Right.
they come to live in the United States, they can't hang on to their culture for very long before they're assimilated into this,
Because they're social creatures.
right, consumer capitalist culture, right?
That's right.
And so the existential crisis is sort of played out in the goddamn it, in cycles, secular fashion, like just like the
Uh-huh.
way you would think of like the on the macro level, macro cultural life cycles, they happen, continuously on the individual level in these cycles of purchasing, and
Uh-huh.
the existential anxiety and all that stuff is depleted in sort of this participation in consumer capitalism.
Right.
And it does become an addiction, right? Because it's self medication is what it is. And so, meanwhile, like we're like little destruction machines, right? We're trying to escape our own, knowledge and anxiety about death and meaninglessness and fear about the ambiguity and the grandness of the universe and everything like that. And we try to narrow our focus into like these little straws, right? To where we're like laser focused on just accumulating crap and just trying to
Right.
compare our crap to other people's crap, and say that our crap's better than their crap, and so therefore I'm better than them,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and we
And
do
we're just
that.
destroying the entire fucking planet. We're taking this pristine nature, right, and it's going through these little consuming machines and turning into fucking giant piles of garbage on the other side.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that one of the things that's caught my attention is the Amish. They are doing a pretty good job of maintaining at least a degree of immunity to industrialism and certainly consumerism.
Yeah.
And I don't have any first-hand knowledge on this. It's only what little I've researched through videos, like on YouTube. But so at least from the image that I have of how the Amish value system functions, they've created their own culture. I don't even know if we'd call it a subculture, but it is a culture that to a very large extent is quite immune to the larger contemporary consensus reality culture, particularly around consumerism. And one of the things I notice about the benefits of a religious culture is that it tends to be ideological. Now,
Mhm.
granted, people take the ideology of religion and they martialize it. They turn it into a physical activity and commit atrocities. So that's not within the scope of what I'm talking about when I say religion, because to me that's not even religion. That's the exploitation of religion for
Yeah,
a whole other
it's not
function.
unique to religion, but
And that's true too, because we see the
politics.
equivalent
Yeah.
we see the equivalent level of destruction going on with capitalism. But
More,
again,
way more.
that
Yeah.
that is not a characteristic of the right to own personal property or personal capital.
Yeah, it's cultural.
Capitalism.
Yeah.
It's it's where capitalism as a economic system is being exploited for another purpose or another function, in the same way that religion can be, education can be. We can take any of our institutions, and I'm sure we can find examples of how that institution is being exploited or being used to exploit well-being in general, to be myopic and short-sighted in how it's being used and actually being self-destructive, but also socially destructive. But anyway, coming back to religion and one of the things that religion can offer is an ideological method or symbolic method of dealing with the existential issues. And so it's all happening within your belief system. And then your primal instincts are responding to those belief systems. So the idea that God loves you can produce the same experience for some people as actually being loved by someone or something. And
Yeah.
because the neurotransmitters that are stimulated by the concepts or the beliefs.
Well, I don't necessarily reject the reality of religious experience, though.
You know the reality of what? Oh,
Religious.
religious
I don't.
experience.
I'm not convinced. I haven't come to the conclusion that it's just a product of our brains. Like, so I'm not ready to say that encounters with God or Jesus or Buddha or whatever it is aren't authentic, or
Well,
you
I
know,
would agree with you that they're authentic and that they actually exist.
right?
And most importantly is that they have merit. They have functional value to contribute to human well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so we're on the same page on that part. But given that our only known, so far as we know, our only way of perceiving is through our nervous system called the
Mm-hmm.
brain, right?
There's something to intuition as well. I think there's a lot
Well,
more
but
to
I think,
consciousness than we know about.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And I agree about the intuition. And again, intuition plays a much larger role in the way human beings exist and the choices that they make, way more than what the average intellectual would even consider as possible. But again, I think that intuition is a function of our nervous system. It, it's a way to know, but that's not conceptual, and
Yeah, yeah.
it's not limited to concepts, and so where am I here? I've gone out on a tangent. Let's bring it back to our
Well, I kind of
question.
wanted to add another piece into the conversation that I think is
Sure.
relevant.
All
So,
right.
can we talk about narratives a little bit more? Maybe
Yeah,
narratives
but
in group
before
psychology.
let's take this moment here. Let me grab a glass of water because
Yeah, I
I've
want to
still
drink
got
too.
my
Okay,
I still got my latte in my throat.
sure.
So
Well, let's talk about
anyway,
I want to talk about narratives in group psychology, right? So
all right.
I think the way culture works, because remember, we have two sort of fundamental motives. One is sort of the fear of death, and the other one's the fear of will or freedom, right? So we don't want any kind of responsibility at all. We don't want to have to impose our will or be willful. We want to live extinctual, right? And so we have a need for there to be some external source of reality. We want somebody else to tell us what reality is.
Third party accreditation.
Right, yeah. We don't want to take on the responsibility or the effort to have to create a culture for ourselves. We want it, and we want to transfer our will into that cultural framework, right? Because we don't want to build it ourselves. Now, the people, you got some people who, let's say, are very comfortable with their will, right? Maybe they don't have as much sense of guilt or shame as other people, and they are very willful, right? And these tend to be people who want a lot of power, right?
Right.
And so those people are comfortable creating cultural frameworks, right? So
Right.
there's a transactional relationship between the masses and like authority figures, right? Where the authority figures will create narratives, right, about the nature of reality and stuff like that, right? But they also and then in exchange, they want the will from the people. They want to have power to be able to control people, right? So
Right.
it's like anytime you get people in a group, not just a group, but a crowd, right? So a crowd is a certain sort of psychological state of masses of people interacting simultaneously, where the crowd becomes an entity of itself, and a lot of the characteristics of the individuals within the crowd change a lot. For example, as individuals, when we're walking down the street, we're usually very, very particular about our personal space, right? We don't want people invading our personal space. We feel really comfortable. But like when you're within a crowd and you become overtaken by that group think, people will smash right into each other, get right in, and they're completely comfortable, right? They become sort of like this hive, sort of this singular entity, right?
Yeah,
so,
right.
So what happens when people are in crowds? Their whole psychology changes. One, their ability to critically think just is greatly diminished, right?
Yeah.
They are completely sort of instinctual. They move with the group. They're controlled by the group, right?
Yeah.
And the group is sort of a symphony, and these authority figures are what are they called? The guys who do this
conductors.
Conductors, right?
Yeah, right.
And so, but the important thing is like how narratives are what create crowds, and you can call them like there's different kinds of crowds. I'm not talking about like the ones that develop after like a soccer game, and people just go ape shit and start turning over cars and stuff like that. That's a type of crowd. But what I'm talking about is crowds at distance, are psychological crowds, where if they're supplied of certain narratives, so narratives have the power to create crowds over long periods of time and from a distance, right? And so a lot of the things like fascism and communism and all these things. So like Hitler didn't really believe in fascism personally, right? Hitler saw the narrative of fascism as an effective way to create a crowd and therefore gain power, right? And so people in power are always thinking about what is the best narrative to use to create a crowd, in order for me to become the head of that crowd, the leader, and gain power, right? And so I think, and that's been true forever, they used to call it statescraft or whatever, is the ability to create narratives and create crowds and gain power.
Well,
right?
And what are some examples of those kind of mega narratives, big, powerful narratives? We have a lot of examples of those, don't we?
Yeah, American exceptionalism is one. That's a big one. Fascism, like Nazism, fascism. Communism.
Communism.
Fascism, the narrative is blood and soil, right? That's what it is. The motherland, the fatherland, this soil is very important. And all the people who are from this soil, who have this genetic sort of commonality, we are the superior ones.
So nationalism is part of what you're referring to when you say fascism.
It's blood and soil. I think that's a perfect way to describe fascism.
Right.
Yeah.
And religion.
That's not mine. That's from another YouTuber who came up with that blood and soil thing. I can't remember his name though. I'll put it in the description though, so I find out. I don't want to take credit for that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But what makes religion powerful is the narrative.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
the narrative
and
creates the crowd.
the narrative, the narrative is a the narrative is a external thing that can be internalized, and in the process provide a personal context, a personal belief system, value system, and information, and even intent, and one's attitude. For example, Christianity, which is the religion that I'm most familiar with, um, the intent is to love thy neighbor as thyself. I mean, as far as the if we're gonna use the teachings of Jesus and what his narrative was as the cornerstone or the basis of Christianity, then we can go with what I'm saying here. Um, and but the ultimate intent was to love God with all the mind and all the soul, and to love thy neighbor as thyself. But in either case, it's still this emotional investment in alignment with something other than yourself is one of the primary intentions of that narrative. And then there's a whole belief system that builds around that one primary intention,
Yeah,
and a value system that builds around it. So, it's called, the gospel is the good news. Well, the good news is the narrative, right?
yeah. The narrative so the narrative is a tool for creating the crowd, right? And the crowd is what people want because like I said, when you're in a crowd, people lose their ability to think critically, right? They lose their sense of individualism. They become part of the collective. They become almost instinctually like connected to the will of the group, right? And so
Yeah.
all the things that we need, like we don't want to be able to think that critically because one of the problems with being a human being is we understand we're going to die someday. We're rational creatures, right? So we want to cut ourselves off for our own ability to reason, because and also some of these just for example, if you look at like the sentiment of gangster swag, right? The way gangsters walk in the tool, the use slang, and all that kind of stuff, right? So that might, to some people, seem a little bit lowbrow, but it's a way to gain a sense of identity and meaning and stuff like that. And if you if you contrast that to like someone who's very prestigious, right? Someone who went to Oxford and they carry around that stupid fake fucking accent to tell people they went to Oxford. They think that is somehow that cultural sentiment is somehow superior to the gangster swag.
Yeah.
But it's the exact same thing. It's just like these really crude sort of playing out of these cultural sentiments and roles and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
But in order for any of that stuff to be effective, right, you have to give up your own sense of individualism. You have to give up your own sense of critical thinking.
Well,
right?
now there's an exchange.
That black it costs.
Is it that black and white though? Isn't there increments or degrees of giving up one's own will and degrees of not wanting to have our own will?
Yeah, of course.
I think it's a messy mix of these various elements that you're talking about.
Well, like I said, the people who want power, they are comfortable with will, and they want yours too.
Yeah. And yet they have their capacity for that. There's a point at which the person with absolute power will fail to execute their absolute power, and I think we're watching this with the Ukraine war. My understanding is, which again is mostly speculation, but I think there's some degree of accuracy in my understanding of Russia's military capabilities. They could level Ukraine. They could go in there and just take it all over.
Yeah, but then NATO would destroy Russia, and then it would lead to nuclear war. So
at that point, he's thinking, wait a minute, maybe I better self-regulate some of this power. But I think that not only is it NATO, because I'm not sure that Putin is wise enough to respect the consequences of what would happen if he gets out of hand. But maybe he is. Maybe
I think he is.
he has that much critical thinking. Because the thing of it is critical thinking goes out the window not only with the crowd but also with the leader. But I'm thinking more, not so much critical thinking or strategic thinking. I'm thinking here more at an instinctual or intuitive level, that the people with power will self-regulate their power. They'll, you know, based on certain instinctual readings, I'm just saying that Russia's invasion of Ukraine may be illustrating this thing I'm talking about with Putin, where he isn't using all of the power that he has at his available to him. There's some self-regulation involved, and I'm only speaking now that the person who doesn't have the guilt, and they're comfortable with power up to a certain degree, but then even that person will have their point at which they won't cross. There's a line that they won't cross, that they can't. They don't have the psychological ability to cross it. It seems to me. So anyway, I'm just saying that I think it's a really messy mix of various things.
Yeah, I'm just generalizing just to make it easier to articulate and to think about these ideas. Yeah, it's definitely a messy mix.
It makes it more difficult for me to think about.
But just to put,
because I don't think in terms of black and white.
Just to conclude, what I'm saying is there's a symbiotic relationship between power and the masses, right? And cultural narratives and groupthink or crowds or whatever you want to call it, group psychology, are all sort of in the mix there. But so I think what we're talking about though is sort of being in possession of your own personal will to the degree like maybe like an authoritarian would have, but without having this symbiotic need to control others, or this extra need to control others, or this dependency on tyranny or control or manipulation or anything like that, right? So step out, so you're not a participant in the cultural groupthink or the crowd, and you're also not an authoritarian person, right? But you're some other thing, to where and this is where I call it, you call it the hero's journey, whatever you want to call it, but, sort of, I think, and this is what we're talking about, is how do you extricate yourself from that sort of cultural system without overloading yourself with too much anxiety and guilt and so on and so forth. And how do you do that in a way where you don't fall into your own personal delusions and end up on the street raving to people who aren't there, right? So it's like it's a tricky situation. I think it's possible, right? And I think we talked about those tools in the last one. We're developing compassion, empathy, all these kind of things. I think no self is a huge one, right? Like the Buddhist practice, no self.
No, being selfless.
Just no self. There is no self. There is no Jason. Jason doesn't exist. It's just a delusion. It's a symbolic designation that we're constantly trying to maintenance and reinforce, that in the end it doesn't really exist, right? So that's a method. In Buddhism, like, they don't distinguish too much between ontology and I don't know I guess you could call it phenomenology. I don't know what it is, but basically the method, because they believe that there's something that reincarnates, right? So obviously there's some sort of self that they believe in, right? But no self is like it's a method for becoming detached from your own ego, so that way you eliminate the bias a bit and you can see reality more clearly. If you're not constantly, your ego's like a fucking ball and chain you're always dragging around. It needs so much maintenance and attention. There's so much anxiety and all that shit wrapped up into it. If you can dissolve that to a certain degree where it's not all that important to you, right, then that frees your attention to sort of try to figure out, well, then what is reality really? You're right?
You're more of the filter isn't as tight, and you're more available to, your perception is more available to see directly instead of only the interpretation, because the filter creates interpretation, is the way I understand it. But a lot of what you've just said there, Jason, it corresponds to some of the things I understand about myself and the way I've lived my life. Part of the taking inventory thing. In fact, I wrote something last night about a coherent narrative for myself. That what I'm looking for at this time in my life is a coherent narrative of how I got here instead of there. Where the narrative that will create an alignment between who I am and how I have lived my life.
Are you saying you had particular goals?
Yeah.
Okay, and then you failed in those goals.
I haven't achieved those goals yet.
Yeah, so you failed, right?
And I'm all right with the word fail.
Yeah. I mean, we fail all the time. It's part of life, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's like what is the narrative you're trying to create about it?
Well, the narrative is an intellectual grasp. It's a, I don't know, maybe I should read it to you. That's a trippy deal. I don't know where that is. I wrote it just last evening, but about the narrative. But back to what we have discussed so far we haven't. It could probably be more clear, but we have discussed the content of what is the risk. We've talked about and around what the risk is of not subscribing to a social role, and some of the the risks, the variables, and what that's like.
The risk is insanity.
Well, that's one risk.
Yeah, that's a risk.
It's
yeah.
not the
I mean,
only
that's the
one
worst
because,
one, probably.
So far as I know, I don't qualify for insane yet, but I've certainly had my opportunities to, except for some kind of instinctual thing, I turned right instead of left.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see how what goes on. For example, I have a cousin who has pretty severe mental illness, schizophrenia kind of thing, and the similarities between him and myself are pretty strong.
Mm.
And it's like, well, how did I not get as far down that rabbit hole as he got?
Well,
right?
I think schizophrenia is a medical condition.
Yeah.
Similar to, it's like the opposite of Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, but so I'm not. You make that statement because it fits within what we're talking about, but I'm not seeing the connection. Can you connect it for me?
Oh no, because when I talk about going insane, I guess I'm being hyperbolic. I don't think rejecting culture would actually turn into being schizophrenic. As in a clinical diagnosis of schizophrenia, right? I think that's kind of a medical condition. I think that the fear of that, the overwhelming anxiety and all that kind of stuff that comes from it, from rejecting culture or being independent, can lead to severe mental health. I don't know. I was just saying, technically, I don't think you can become schizophrenic from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I have this unexamined theory that a lot of the people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia are people who are part of the frontier of human consciousness, but they didn't have the mental the structure to their structural framework for and they venture outside of consensus reality and can't find their way back.
Yeah, or they're not well. Yeah, consensus reality is there because it serves a purpose psychologically, right? And so if they took off, but they didn't deal with those psychological issues before they took off. They just kind of took off willy
Yeah.
nilly.
Well,
Yeah.
or back away from that, venturing out into the frontier, and I mean, there's plenty of places that I can't remember of a specific instance right at the time, but I remember that there have been multiple instances in which I said, "Hold it, wait a minute. You know, I don't feel secure about going that far with whatever it was my thought process was." And so, I stepped back into something more known, more familiar, more
Mm-hmm.
within my belief system, which is would be also more conventional. And some people don't step back. This is just all my own conjecture of, what it looks like from my mind. I think it would be a very suitable subject for some serious research on it, but I guess it's like a hypothesis. But so when you said that the risk is insanity, it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, you bet. From my perspective, it's like it's most definitely, which would include what is what qualifies as schizophrenia. Now there may be a schizophrenia that's strictly what you're saying, like a medical condition, and then there may be another type of schizophrenia that's manifesting the same symptoms, but it comes from uh, something other than a purely medical condition. I was just interrupted there a moment there with there was something that I came across probably reading that I didn't get the full recall of what it was, but it's like what I was just saying there uh, was more than just my own hunch about it. It belonged to somebody that something I read that somebody else has worked with that has probably more experience with the topic than I do. But anyway, so yeah, that's we talked about the risks and schizophrenia is one of them. But
It's
for
definitely
me, the
doable, though. I think
the
plenty
you
of
think
people have
what?
proven that it's doable. It's achievable to step outside. I mean, you're going to be in
Oh
it a little
yeah,
bit. You
no,
can't
I
be
think
completely out of it, but yeah, I think it's possible. There's plenty
I
of people who have proven that you can live a well-rounded and psychologically healthy sort of life, uh, and still live at the beat of your own drum, right? And still seek truth and
exactly.
reject
Yeah,
groupthink and stuff like that. Yeah.
and I think you and I are two cases in point that my what I one of the things that I've learned is that the the major thing that has influenced the way I've lived my life is a memory recall deficiency. That I don't have the ability I don't have enough of the ability to to like read something and then remember it and regurgitate it. And so that put me at odds with the formal academic process. Because I've got lots of academic, but I had to do it at my own pace in my own way, and not require that I be able to regurgitate it on command. So I just, I've in recent years I've come to realize that I've had this learning disability, all of my life, and so that has made part of the conventional, many of the conventional roles just unavailable to me. So I think that my curiosity about the frontier of consciousness probably would have always been there, whether I did that more within a more conventional role or the way I did. So I'm in one of these places now where I've gone out on the explanation of something that I've lost track. And this is an example of the memory thing. It's like I can't right now. I can't remember what the point was of what I'm saying. That has an impact, especially socially.
You know,
And
Nietzsche wrote a whole book, I think, talking about the same stuff we're talking about now, at least in terms of narrative, I think,
uh-huh.
called Genealogy of Morals. I think that
Yeah.
was, I mean, it's been about 15 years, but if I remember correctly, the whole point of the book was, is it possible for human beings to exist outside of a narrative, right? Like a basically narcissistic narrative that creates a morality or delusion system, to deal with our existential stuff. Is it possible to see the world directly, to live outside of a narrative? And I think the closing line of his book, which is one of my favorite quotes of all time, he quoted another philosopher, how do you say his name? Jean
Satire.
Satir. But
Yeah.
the quote was, man would rather have the void as its purpose than to be void of purpose.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And so even the rejecting of the narrative becomes a narrative.
Well, yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it might be possible for us to live without a narrative, but I don't see a reason to do that. I don't know what the benefit would be, how an individual's well-being would be enhanced by not having a narrative. And the other is that it is the nature of the human brain to create a story, to create a narrative, to connect the pieces. That's just such an instinctual thing. And to have a I am, right? Even like with Jesus, when he was asked, "Who are you?" He says, "I am that I am." Now, that's a pretty comprehensive and precise narrative. That
Yeah, I guess. I think
I
that
mean, to me,
if
that
there's
that was his
anything,
explanation of who he is, what he's up to, what he's about. But it would still be a narrative.
I think if there's anything that exists, like what the Buddhists call enlightenment or nirvana,
Uh huh.
I think that enlightenment would be being without narrative in perceiving reality directly. So that's what I would say would be like that to me. That's what enlightenment is, and that's my goal in life was to see it. I'll probably never, not probably. I won't ever
Well,
get
then
there,
there's
but yeah,
yeah. So the interesting thing that pops up here, Jason, is it's one thing to have a narrative that defines your experience of reality, and that if it doesn't fit the narrative, then you don't see it. That's one kind of narrative.
hmm
There's another narrative that is just a useful tool for being able to have a sense of the entirety of who you are and what you're about. But it's more just an intellectual grasp on what you believe to be true about yourself that doesn't necessarily limit your ability to notice something new
yeah.
in
Well, it's like
yourself
a
or
veil.
others.
It's the narrative. I'm talking about the narrative that creates a veil that prevents you from perceiving the world
Right.
accurately. Yeah, yeah.
That's a particular type of or application of a narrative. When Nietzsche was speaking about is it possible to live without a narrative, it's like, well, which type of narrative was he thinking of? The can you live without a narrative that restricts your perception of reality? I would say yes. You know, um, and I can see lots of reasons why to not have that type of narrative. Whereas the other narrative that's just more like a convenience. For me it's an intellectual convenience. I have something about me that, and I think it relates to the existential issues, but that having an intellectual grasp. And for a long time, I worked on getting rid of my need for an intellectual grasp on reality, particularly the part of reality that's myself, to understand myself intellectually. And I felt like, well, that was a shortcoming. I need to learn how to be able to function and live my life fully without the requirement to understand myself. And now I'm getting more to the side of, well, now wait a minute. The truth is that I have this need, I have this itch. So maybe what I ought to do is look at what to do have with myself, what to do with that need. Is getting rid of the need the optimum thing for me to do, or maybe there's something better to do with it? And that's kind of where I am actually in real time, uh, with what I said earlier about I'm looking for a narrative,
Mm-hmm.
because that looking uh, purposefully and intentionally looking for a narrative that makes sense of my existence, right? That is 180 degrees of what I've been doing for most of my life, which was to get by and succeed and achieve what I wanted to do in life, uh, without any kind of a narrative, without this abstract version of who I am, even to considering it a bad thing, of being at enmity with this part of myself that needs to have an intellectual understanding of who I am and what am I about. So that's been a real
Yeah.
change. So anyway, we have, though, I think, talked a lot about the risks. It's not a well organized presentation where all the pieces all connect up all that well, but we've definitely dove into the content of that topic of what is that risk. And the other one was about how do we go about creating a morality when we know that our perception how do yeah that that our perception of reality is fallible. And for me, I think there's a lot to be gained in staying close to that earthbound ethos, and the
What, natural law?
yeah, natural law, more of a biological ethos rather than a fabricated one. Given what's happened with morality as a intellectually fabricated thing, as an abstract thing, it has demonstrated a lot of shortcomings. Whereas if we just pay attention to what is it that supports optimum well-being, and we're already hardwired for that anyway. That's what our conscience is wired to.
Yeah, I think what gets me to possession of more of my will and makes me more conscious are things that are valuable, right? And things behaviors or frameworks or narratives that prevent me from becoming more conscious and more aware, and who prevent me from obtaining and maintaining my own personal will are evil or counterproductive, is my sense, right? And I just think that it just so happens that, as far as like avoiding the risks of thinking for yourself and not being part of a group or a narrative or a crowd, it just so happens that being kind and empathetic and forgiving and all these kind of things, all the Jesus stuff, if you emulate the values he demonstrated, right, for some reason, I think it's pretty miraculous. I think it's a cool thing that equals confidence, your ability to live confidently without delusion or narrative, right? So it's like you have to practice these behaviors of forgiveness and empathy and compassion to the best that you can in order to shield yourself against insanity, right? As you're moving out of delusion and as you're taking more possession of your own personal will from the authority of culture. Yeah, and I think it's just a gradual progression in that direction for me.
And so there would be, is it accurate to say that your ethos, there's like three pillars to your ethos, and that's compassion, forgiveness, and empathy?
Well, I would say no. It's awareness, consciousness, will, and Christ. Those are the three pillars. Yeah.
All right, and Christ. That means different things to different people. What does it mean to you?
The life, the values he demonstrated, the behaviors he demonstrated in his life.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, living Christ-like, right?
Yeah.
Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the path, right? Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's referred to also as Christ consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's consistent with what I've found out so far. What you're just saying, and that's how my work as a philosopher has distilled down to that simple one phrase: do what love would do.
Yeah.
Do what your love would do.
And I'm not religious or anything. I just use Christ because it's just
Right.
a European thing to use. But you can the Buddha, whatever you know, Muhammad, however you want to relate to it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because those qualities that are a part of that Christ consciousness are pretty universal among the esoteric teachings.
Yeah, it's like a universal archetype. Would that be a good way of saying it?
I think it qualifies as that.
Yeah.
So that it doesn't it the fact that reality is ambiguous and we don't have a franchise on absolute truth, that becomes a non-thing. It becomes irrelevant in my mind. I don't have to have a grasp on the absolute truth about morality in order for me to live my ethos, which is my morality.
Right,
And
because you might
in order
not
for
have
me to do what
yeah.
in order for me to do what to the best of my understanding is what my love would do, my deep care and concern for mutual well-being, and what would that do? What would that cause me to do? And to just keep aiming and guessing at that doesn't require that I know that I know absolutely what love is or what love does. I only need to know what my best understanding of it and to be true to that. And so that gives me the security that comes from knowing that I have an ethos. I have something that supports what I believe is the optimum quality. Well-being is the quality that is supported and does the least harm. Makes me the best version of myself. But it's all really just personal. It's not. I don't even have to know what God expects of me.
I think
in order to I don't have to know what God expects of me in order to live up to what God expects of me.
I think this is a good place to cut it right here, because then if we could get into something else from here, but this is a good place to stop for right now. I think we came that from my perspective and your perspective about the whole compassion, love, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I think that kind of brings the conversation full circle. I think it's a good place to end.
Well, yeah, because we started off with questions and now we've ended up with how we've answered those questions for ourselves.
Yeah.
So that's, fairly coherent.
It's not supposed to be completely coherent. It's just a conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to stop recording now. So thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.